Street Fighter II bows in London. Nintendo admits bootlegs are legit. And Microsoft's Minesweeper invades Windows. These stories and a special guest co-host on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl, and Peter is off on assignment, aka so bogged down by work he just could not find the time to record. So we are joined today by a very special guest, John from the Retro Game Squad. Hello, John.
Hello. How are you doing? It's good to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. We've been talking about doing something like this, well, for a while now, and I'm just really glad that it worked out this way.
Yeah, likewise. It's been almost a year in the making, probably a little bit more. It's crazy how time's been flying.
Yeah, I tell you, just sitting at home with nothing to do because of COVID, it just seems like the months melt away or something. Oh my God, it's already been a year. Okay. So, for listeners who are not familiar with your work, give us a brief rundown of Retro Game Squad.
Yeah, absolutely. Retro Game Squad is used to be monthly. Now we do a recording 4 times a year. We pick a topic and we pick games from the entire retro base for our NES all the way up to N64, PlayStation era games, and we review them and we have a lot of fun. My friends Jeff and Alex were the hot butter through a knife of retro gaming podcast.
Yeah, and I've been listening to you guys for probably since like episode 3 or 4. And
wow.
It was, I jumped on the bandwagon early, and that's also when I started or restarted doing stuff online about retro games. I've been out of that field for a few years, and you guys got me going through through your old discussion boards. That's when I hooked up with Mads and Drisk and started doing the Retro Gaming Club. And
that's right.
Yeah, so it's very much because of you guys that this show exists. It's kind of scary now that I think about it. The circle closes.
Yeah, well, it's very humbling for us on our end. I hear from a lot of people who listened to us in the beginning, and they we kicked off renewed a lot of interest for retro games through what we do, which is very cool. And it's so funny that you mentioned our old forums. That was definitely the place to be for a bit.
Oh man, it was amazing. The community was great. It also had the whole game of the month thing where everybody was playing the game, and it was a great place to be. It was very, very welcoming, and you guys are still doing it today, basically on Discord. You've just moved over there. Yeah.
It's a much more live discussion of things, but it kind of there's discussion that happens pretty fluidly, and then there's also discussion where it kind of follows the forums material. I actually brought one of the forum games over where we work through the alphabet, and somebody introduces a game for like letter A, and then whoever guesses what the game was introduces a letter B with like maybe a screenshot, and it's been cool to see some of that kind of translate to what we have in the Discord. And of course, that's allowed us to keep in touch too, which is even more value.
That's true. And it's kind of weird. It's these long distance friendships that have really grown stronger through the retro gaming community. And
absolutely,
it's something, especially in these trying times, that really, really has an immense value.
I agree. I couldn't have said it better.
No. This is why they pay me the big bucks.
There you go. How do I get in on some of that?
I don't know. I mean, you two pennies together, rub them for heat or something. That's okay.
Yep.
Now, that's the banter section, as listeners know. And last episode, we basically started something that Peter and I had been talking about doing for a while, which was to add some more gameplay meat to the news bone that is the show. And unfortunately, Peter's not here to partake of that segment that we were calling Peter's 7 Minutes in Heaven, where I choose a game that was reviewed in the month that we're jumping to, which in this case is going to be February of 1991. And instead, John, the pleasure falls onto you to be basically the guinea pig that I am going to expose an old game to. How do you feel about that?
I am both honored and concerned, and I am ready to do this. I'm really excited to just kind of hop into it and
Excellent.
get to it.
And I've chosen a very special game because this was, in many ways, the last great moment in the limelight from a technical standpoint for my favorite computer of all times, the Commodore 64. Because today we're going to be looking at Turrican 2 on the C64. Not Turrican 2 on the Amiga, which is where basically it has the big legendary status as being the ultimate action game on that platform. But we're going with the simultaneously released C64 version, not only because it's a technical marvel for the system, but because I'm probably not going to get a chance to really highlight another C64 game for several more years until we start looping back around, and I was not going to let this chance pass me by. So, with that being said, John, you've never played this game before, correct?
No, I have very little exposure to the first one either, especially on this Commodore 64.
Excellent. So, we're going to now jump over, let John play for 7 minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to find out what his impressions were. So, welcome back, John. How was your 7 minutes in heaven?
It feels weird to be back. I want to keep playing.
So, describe the game.
Ooh, so yeah, it's your typical side-scrolling platformer, except you're a badass. I'm assuming robot with a gun.
Power suited.
Power suited. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. They you go left and right and you kill bad dudes, and they drop different colored orbs that you use to get different weapons. I had asked you if how many levels you can go up. It's very all of those top scrolling shooters and all of that, where you're getting the different weapons to upgrade your abilities. The game's cool. I like it, especially the C64 presentation. There's a lot there, and I had subtly mentioned that I appreciate a lot of what these devs can do with such limited hardware. Things like stepping under waterfalls, but you can see water splash off your shoulders, and I really only had 7 minutes to play this game because I could at least use like maybe 14.
Yeah, and you didn't make it to any of the bosses yet, right?
No, I had a chance to run around the first stage and get used to the controls. I think I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I didn't grow up with a Commodore, so there was a little bit of of controller shock.
You mean up to jump isn't a natural thing?
You know, it hasn't been for a while, but I appreciate it. It dusting off those cobwebs, because there were some old DOS games that I played where, yeah, up was definitely the jump button. And
that's true. That's true. Yeah.
it's like it felt so foreign, but it felt very familiar at the same time. That's a quote. Yeah, and the moment that music hits on that title screen, I could spend 7 minutes just listening to that.
Oh yeah, I mean the SID chip is really taken full advantage of in that game. It's atmospheric, and like you were saying, the programming. This is Manfred Trentz, which he's right up there. There's a handful of Commodore 64 programmers from back in the day who achieved legendary status because of what they could pull out of that machine, and he literally was unparalleled. He was the one who created the 8-way scrolling levels, and that was the origin of the first game. Was just he managed to make 8-way scrolling work, and then it was like, well, now we have to build a game around it.
Okay. That's super cool. I did not know that.
Yeah. And that's how it originated. And then they were basically just taking ideas from a bunch of other games that they had played and stuff. This is where you also get a little bit of that Metroid element with the spinning ball shape mode and stuff like that.
Yeah, that threw me off a little bit. I wasn't ready for that. That's cool though. I wish I could have seen. I assume it uses more of that like later on in the levels to fully have you play around with that mechanic.
Oh yeah,
I found myself backtracking a lot.
That's one of the big differences between this game and a lot of other shoot 'em ups. It's not just left to right. If you go through the levels become very labyrinthian. It's really a lot more about exploration than just shooting everything. Mm-hmm. Finding your way around. Like in that first level, I think you only found one of the 1-ups, but there's like 7 of them hidden all over the place.
Oh,
yeah. And there's a ton of platforms you can jump on. Like you can actually backtrack all the way to the start of the level by just jumping through the platform. So you're like, 30, 40 feet above the rest of the level. And there's a whole series of platforms up there that lead up to more 1-ups and things like that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's exactly what I did. I fell back to the beginning and I felt like I replayed a good segment. I killed all the dudes so they didn't come back. All the little Ed 209 guys. Don't tell Jeff.
No, I won't tell Jeff that Ed 209s die by the dozen in this game. This is basically, there's going to be a couple more big C64 technical achievements, games like Creatures 1 and 2 and Mayhem and Monsterland that really are going to push the hardware in different directions. But this is probably the last big one where the C64 still has enough market presence that the game is also basically going to go down as a huge hit.
I could see that. Yeah. It's addictive. I probably will end up playing this more tonight after we're done recording. So this is
go for it. There's also later on some levels where you're in a spaceship. Basically, it's sort of R-type-ish.
Oh, cool! Very cool.
Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense because Manfred Trentz is also the person who did the official port of R-Type to the C64.
Oh wow! Okay. Yeah, I definitely trust my gameplay in his hands.
Oh yeah, no, he's great. That's actually a really solid port. He also did a very unofficial version of Super Mario Brothers called The Great Gianna Sisters, which got pulled from the shelves because, well, it was just a little bit too much like Mario.
Those characters are still around these days too. I feel like I've seen like new platformers with those.
Yeah, they brought them back. They brought them back about 10 years ago. And the game was only on sale maybe for a few months before it got pulled. The Amiga port was never officially released. But the copies were out there. And everybody who had a C64 or an Amiga had copies of the Great Gianna Sisters. It's a cult classic, especially in Europe.
That's so cool. Yeah, talk about humble beginnings there.
Yeah, really. But like I said, Manfred Trentz was just an amazing programmer. He just basically faded out after the C64. I mean, he doesn't do interviews anymore. He's still working with the Factor 5 guys. They just re-released the Turrican games as a collection on the Switch. And I'm not sure if the C64 versions are in there, but I think they are in the anthology. And so he's still working with them and sort of advising. But yeah, he doesn't give interviews or anything. He's just kind of decided, I'm going to do my quiet little background thing. It's
a lot of respect
amazing.
for that.
Yeah. Okay. So before we can turn on the time machine, we need to first check in with Ethan for this episode's Department of Corrections. Welcome back to the show, Ethan. What do you got for us in our January 1990 jump?
Gonna push knowledge out to the world. Knowledge that has been corrupted by the evil forces of Carl.
Oh, it wanted to be corrupted.
Yes, the 90s were a very strange time. Especially now that we're getting past the solely Nintendo era, but you're just on the cusp of it. You're getting there.
Dude, I was in Europe. I was in Europe for most of this. You know what? We didn't even know what the NES was. I knew one guy who had an NES. That was it. We were all Amiga and C64 kids. What can I say? But, okay. What did I get wrong? Well, no, we need to start with something far more important than what I got wrong.
It is the Peter coming! Where's the echo?
We really do need a sound effect for that.
Yeah, yes. So just to say to Peter, there's no shame in having the voices in your head. That's what the voices tell me.
And maybe your voices and Peter's voices should get together and hash this out. Maybe write a manifesto or something, or maybe don't. The more I say it, the worse it sounds.
The voices are telling me that's a good idea. So.
Cool.
Past that, we will move on to actually what happened in 1991, in which, well, Peter was around, but I wasn't around yet.
Damn kids.
You were asking the question of when Bit Corporation went away. It went away in 1992.
Yeah, and I found another company with a similar name, and I just passed it by, didn't write it down, and I did not do my research carefully enough. Thank you very much for correcting that.
Yeah, and actually I'm remembering now that you said that it still exists today, but no, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Then next one, we're talking extensively about the machinations of Mr. Hyatt. In which case we do not want to get sued about anything, but this has nothing to do with him in this case. This is just saying that you said that, with his patent he could go after Intel for their microprocessor patents, but Intel didn't actually have the patent on the microprocessor. It was Texas Instruments. And basically this was a strange, I almost want to say sleight of hand situation. It's a little complicated. There's a book on Intel out there. I think it's called Intel, the World's Greatest Company or Most Important Company. One of them's most important. One of them's greatest. I forget. It's the same guy. But in this thing, he describes that there's this patent machination sort of thing. Intel was really late on filing their patent, and TI had something that was sort of kind of a microprocessor. There's some of this info on the Wikipedia page for microprocessor, but basically, TI is the one who actually had the patent.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and I remember there was something about them either sharing the patent or some other nonsense. And I know it was TI that ultimately beat him in court. But yeah.
Yeah, because they would be the ones that got all the licensing revenue from everybody else.
Gotcha.
Yeah, even though it's completely not fair looking from a historical standpoint, but legality and history are two different things. Isn't that right, Carl?
All I have to say is it only matters what you can prove in court.
Anyhow.
And the fact that you paid your lawyers on time. Remember,
never
don't pay your lawyer.
Don't be Trammell. You're going to get to that story. And then that's going to be fun.
Yeah, we've touched on Trammell's poor choice of attorneys already a couple of times, but those cases are about to come to an end, yes.
Yeah. And then finally, you were wondering what the STE stands for, of the Atari STE. The E stands for Enhanced.
Yes.
This took a little digging, actually, to figure out. But it's not extended, which I thought it was originally, but it is Enhanced.
Yeah. The Atari hardware strategy at that point is still something that eludes me completely. But I guess it was just, we can put it out there. Let's see if it sticks. Go figure. Okay. Was that it?
That's it for 1991.
Awesome. Oh, and I said 1990, didn't I? Because you wrote 1990 in your notes. I tell you, this correction of corrections here. Go figure. Okay, well, hey, Ethan, thanks a bunch for keeping us honest, and
always.
Look forward to seeing you in our next jump.
All right, to 2001.
Okay, so I have been made humble, and humble enough to say, let's do it all again and travel back in time and look at more headlines. Just as a warning to all the listeners, remember that we are using cover dates of publications for the date of February 1991. So obviously all the events happened at some point before that. And this is just the way we organize stuff here on the show, and that's why Newsroom is in the title. And I guess we also have to do the quick plug. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and we've got a Patreon. Link is in the show notes below. Ready to jump back in time 30 years, John?
Yeah, let's go.
Cool.
I got my time travel hat on.
Awesome. Going back in time, or something like that. Okay.
Now there's a new building, a video arcade.
1991.
Virtual reality.
Let's play Thunderblade. The market's very fickle.
Welcome back to February of 1991. John, what's our first headline?
Well, let's see here. For the first headline, we have ATI show in London shows off lots of sequels and clones.
The Amusement Trade Exhibition International Arcade Industry Show in London is chock-a-block full of sequels and clone products. Successful titles like Operation Wolf have now spawned the likes of Space Gun, Laser Ghost, and Steel Gunners. Taito's WGP gets competition in the form of GP Rider. Konami's Overdrive is an Outrun clone. Afterburner gets a spiritual sequel from Sega with G-Lock, and of course the amazing R360 cabinet. And it goes on with the likes of Super Space Invaders 91, Double Dragon 3, and the fun-looking Street Fighter 2. Maybe that'll do well. The big innovation seems to be digitized imagery, though, with Atari's Pit Fighter, Williams' High Impact Football, and the Laserdisc-based Mad Dog McCree. So, just out of curiosity, out of all those titles, other than Street Fighter 2, how many of those have you ever played?
A good mix of them. It's funny that you mentioned the Laserdisc game. I collect Laserdisc, so I'm very aware of what other
Oh, really?
Laserdisc games had come out at the time. Yeah, I wish I had the Laserdisc game consoles, but I actually have a Laserdisc player that I collect the movies for.
Oh, cool. That is really cool. Aren't there add-ons for Laserdisc players that basically give you that extra functionality?
Some of them do. Some of them come with serial ports. I have a very, very basic Panasonic version. I think I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, no, they definitely do. It's a neat piece of hardware.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, Laserdisc is one of those things that completely passed me by back in the day. Then again, limited budgets and all that stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I always drooled over director's commentaries. Just the access to that information would have been so nice back in the day.
Yeah, the format that they came out in, kind of like LP discs or the vinyls did, is I've got ones where it's a complete book, and then the laser disc is in the back sleeve.
Nice.
I have the One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest album that I have. It's got the complete screenplay built into the book that is the actual disc case. It's really cool. And these are like full size encasings. It's really neat.
Nice. Oh, see, that's the kind of stuff that you just don't get. A cinephile doesn't get those really cool niceties for the most part nowadays. I mean, granted, a lot of that stuff can be purchased separately, but still, I miss those days.
As do I.
Yeah. But yeah, so at this show, everybody's really bemoaning that the coin-op business seems to be suffering, and we've talked about this on the show for the last year. Basically, it's that the coin-op operators continue to keep bemoaning that there's no really innovative new product that's going to drive the kids away from the home consoles and into the arcades. And yeah, none of these games here are really going to light the world on fire except for Street Fighter 2, because it's really starting a new paradigm. The idea of, having to learn all the moves and learn all the secrets, and that quick play and quick turnover of coin is really going to bring some cash back into the coffers of the operators.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, games like Afterburner and those had the full sit-in cabinets, though. There's nothing cooler as a kid to sit down in that big arcade cabinet, speakers blaring, and pretend you're in a fighter plane and all of that. Like, I think that's where the value of the arcades still are.
Oh, definitely. The only problem is that from an operator standpoint, how often are you going to play that game? How many coins are you going to pop in? You're putting in a massive investment, but the kid's going to play it maybe once or twice, but how many people really played through Afterburner?
That's a very good point.
The game gets super samey after a while. There's no new secrets to unlock. They're just, more planes on the screen. After you've done it like 5 or 6 times, you're just like, okay, I've done this.
Yeah, and some of the versions of the ports of the games were literal just palette swaps, and the same enemies do a ton more damage. This is going to be great.
It gets even worse. If you really want one of the worst coin-op conversions of all time, the European release of Afterburner for the C64.
Oof.
It is, it's so bad. I mean, it's literally an unplayable mess, and almost all the items on the ground are boulders for some reason. There's a certain pain in my soul that will never really go away after that. There was a US port that looked a little bit better, but played just as terribly. So Afterburner on home computers was, that just never really panned out, unless, of course, you owned an X68000, in which case you got an arcade perfect port. But, the damn Japanese always got the good stuff. Okay. I guess let's move on to the next story, staying in the arcades.
Okay. Microprose's first arcade game is a slow burn.
Replay Magazine has a nice write-up about Microprose's F-15 Strike Eagle arcade game. The title apparently earns well if at a location with players willing to learn the game. Because it is trying to be a real simulator, the more advanced options are proving hard to master and may be affecting the game's profits.
Wow. That goes back to our conversation just a minute ago.
Yeah. And this is basically, and we've talked about it on the show, and I also talked about it in my interview with Bill Staley about how big of a failure the F-15 Strike Eagle arcade game was. Have you ever played it?
I have not played the arcade game. There may have been a PC port at some point. I remember spending a lot of time on those flight sims, but I couldn't imagine doing that in the arcade. That's just such a dedication, and you want quick experiences.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it started out years earlier as a series of computer games.
Okay.
F-15 Strike Eagle 2 was already out. F-15 Strike Eagle 3 was in development at this time. And in between all that, they launched an arcade game that wasn't a direct port of any of them, used elements from the two existing games. And it was using vector graphics, and it was just super complicated. I tried playing it once in the arcade, had no idea what the hell was going on, and basically just flew around thinking I was maybe doing something until suddenly I wasn't. And I don't even remember if I got shot down or the timer ran out. I have no idea what happened. And it's basically this idea of trying to offer something new in the arcade. And this was just the wrong thing for the arcade. And it's that separation or tradition where originally the home games were just arcade ports. And that evolution of home gaming being a completely different beast from the arcades is showing that what worked in the home is not going to work in the arcade, and what worked in the arcade may not actually work at home. And that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah, I want to be in that board meeting that decided we're going to go for a F-15 Strike Eagle arcade game, because those games came with literal novels for their manuals, and to just... I'd have to look at the cab for that one, because I wonder if they just plastered the edges with just like manuals and notes and things so you can figure out what your controls do. That's wild.
Yeah, I mean, it had a bunch of controls. It's not nearly as complex as the home computer versions, but still, it was way too complicated. And the idea of having these long extended missions, with multiple goals and stuff, just, it was way, way beyond what you could expect an arcade to use up space on. I mean, because you're literally taking up space from a machine that could be gobbling quarters every couple of minutes. And yeah, it's a huge fracas. It actually helps destabilize the company to a point where they have one bad Christmas a few years after this, and they're wiped out. Again, my interview with Bill Staley is very, very honest about how big of a mess this was, and he takes full responsibility for it. That this was just trying to get into an area that they had no business being in because they did not have a game catalog that was transferable to this format.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I mean, good on them for trying, though. I mean, you gotta put yourself out there to see how it turns out.
That's true. I guess that's one way to put it. Okay, but talking about people putting themselves out there in the arcades, or maybe not.
Yes. Yeah. SNK to hold back home ports of titles.
SNK, the makers of the Neo Geo system, have announced that they will hold back all home releases of their arcade games for 6 months. This will give operators ample chance to profit from the games before the home market can intrude on their profits. Granted, given the extreme price of Neo Geo home systems and games, this won't become a major issue for anyone.
Yeah, the home console was very, very close to the arcade in terms of hardware and the experiences.
No, it was identical. It was the exact same hardware and games, yeah. And they cost as much. Did you ever see what they were going for in the stores?
No, I was still relying on my parents at the time. I haven't for fear of sticker shock.
A single game could run you anywhere between $150 and $200. Exactly. I mean, basically, you could buy an NES and several games for the price of one cartridge, to say nothing of the cost of the console. I mean,
Yeah,
they were going for anywhere between, I think, $300 or $500. It was an insane amount for this machine. It was just, it was beyond the pale.
Yeah, especially at the time too. This is $1991 we're talking about.
Yeah, you have to at least double, maybe 2.5 times it to get to modern pricing. It's just insane. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you have to make the choice if you're going to be putting quarters in the arcade for these games or bringing it home.
Yeah, and there was just also at this point, this is before Neo Geo really has its huge games like Turf Masters and Metal Slug. The first year or two of titles are not what you would call memorable nowadays. It was their baseball game. It was Nam. It was Magician Lord. These are not titles that anybody is really going, oh yeah, I'm going to spend $150 on that when Super Mario Brothers 2 is out on the market. So sadly, this doesn't become an issue, but it was a concern for the arcade operators at this point, because they were seeing ports of arcade hits coming to consoles faster and faster and faster. And an important thing to remember in this time is that in 1990, the game that saved the industry was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And the home port of that, the NES port, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, was the big hit of Christmas that year. So the moment the kids had the game at home, they started to see a drop in the coin intake of the arcade game. And Konami has already announced at this point that the Simpsons game is coming, and they put in their press release, this will not be the same game that's coming to the NES, which Acclaim had the rights to. That became Bart versus the Space Mutants. And that was important for the operators to know that nobody's going to steal our thunder. Nobody's going to be able to buy a home version of this and cost us the coin drop.
That's an interesting perspective, because growing up as a consumer and not someone who owned an arcade, you have to think about the market that's available for people who are operating arcades and looking for their next thing. Like, how do you choose? Do you choose something that's going to get ported to the home console and have that happen to it, or you get the one that's dedicated to it? That's really
it's a huge deal, and you see it. I mean, in magazines like Replay at this point, which is one of the magazines for the coin operated operators. So the coin op operators, and all of the editorials and stuff are talking about the encroaching console market and how it's hurting the operators of the arcade machines. And so this is a real concern for them. And that's why that 6-month window for SNK is like, oh, okay, we will have 6 months. By then, the games are probably not earning that grade anyway, so we're okay. And these windows kept getting shorter or less important for the console, for the game makers, because the game makers are now making so much more off of the home console games than off the arcade games that a lot of them are just shifting more and more resources away from arcade game development. Companies like Capcom, for example, the Mega Man series and so forth is just dwarfing anything that they've done in the arcade for a while. And companies like Konami are producing 1 or 2 big games a year, but they're producing like 5 or 6 for the NES. It's just kind of insane how that balance of power has shifted.
Yeah, that's wild. They the whole R&D that needs to go into creating an arcade port. It's not like nowadays where all of the hardware is kind of caught up with each other. It was either you're going for the Nintendo spec thing or you're going for the arcade spec thing, and there was still that divide there.
Exactly. And also, I mean, you could buy like a PlayChoice 10, which was just an NES, And we talked about this last month, how Nintendo is now trying to push, at this point, is pushing a Super Nintendo variant as arcade hardware as well. But the idea that you go to the arcade because there's something spectacular like an R360 cabinet is not it. The investment in the hardware is growing exponentially, but you're still just charging 50 cents a play. So at a certain point, the math doesn't add up anymore.
Yeah, especially for the initial investment on these arcade cabinets, you got to at least make back what you paid.
Exactly. And the longer that period grows that you need to be able to make that money back on, the closer you are to bumping into the home port version.
Exactly.
And that's really where, a lot of this is going to start breaking down, and where a game like Street Fighter 2 is going to completely revolutionize the paradigm, because it's not a hugely technically advanced game. It's more the gameplay is encouraging coin drop in a way that games previously hadn't. And that's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the the arcade market there. And having, I don't know, do you think, the arcades still had the one up for, pardon the pun, with having the extra buttons that some of these consoles didn't have, especially the NES, because you were limited to jump and you were limited to shoot, and you could move around and pause the game on occasion.
This is true, but you also have to remember that until Street Fighter 2 comes along, all those other games we mentioned are 1 or 2 button games, maybe 3 at the most.
True.
Street Fighter, the original Street Fighter with its 6 buttons, which wasn't a very successful game, mainly because of some very bad design decisions. That one, Street Fighter 2 is going to be the first one that makes that 6 buttons or multiple buttons that do a whole bunch of stuff, and you have to learn move combos. That really was an issue. If you play Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, there's no big move combinations going on there. It's just walk and timing issues. Learn the pattern of the enemy, don't be there when they hit, stuff like that. But the idea of, okay, I've got 6 buttons, each one does something completely different, and if I hit a strong punch as opposed to medium punch at the wrong time, that's success and failure and stuff. That's a paradigm that doesn't really exist in the arcade at this point yet. It will in the coming months, but at this point, it's not there yet. And a great example is just if you look at the mechanics of Pit Fighter, the main gameplay there is players versus CPU. There's bonus rounds where the players play each other, but it's not the core gameplay. And I think it's only a 3-button game, and there's not a lot in the way of move combinations or anything. It's basically just, punch, kick, and I think block, or jump. It's been way too long since I played it. And for good reason. It kind of isn't a good game to play. But oh well. Yeah. Okay, let's move away from the arcades. We got to go back into the home.
Yes, we do. Over-ordering puts pressure on console game makers.
Game publishers are cautiously bullish about the state of the market at the winter CES. While the console industry hit a whopping $4 billion worth of revenue in 1990, over-ordering on some games has resulted in a glut on the market, with some games being discounted.
Because that's never happened before.
No, it hasn't. And this is really one of these moments where everybody thought, okay, we just keep pumping out the games. We keep making them. And for our Patreon listeners, if you listen to my 2-part episode interview with Greg Fischbach, co-founder of Acclaim, he actually talks about this quite frankly, that at this point in time, it's a marketing deal. There's a lot of games just being put out there that the content of the game is irrelevant to the publishers. It's about, okay, does it have a cool name? Does it have a cool license? It will sell. And this is the first time where that isn't necessarily proving true. And one of the reasons for it is that even though the NES market is super hot, there's also more and more back catalog games that are still available. So going into 1990, Christmas 1990, let's say I'm a kid who just got my NES that year for my birthday. Going into Christmas, I don't have to buy the latest game with a license on it. I can hear from all my buddies, dude, you got to pick up this game called Contra. Oh, dude, you got to check out Castlevania. Oh, dude, you got to pick up all these older titles that are still available in the stores. They're still being printed. And so even as the market is growing, the quality of the games has to be a little bit higher in order to stand out, because you have so much back catalog to compete with.
Yeah, you have to think at the time too that they didn't have as robust reporting on how, it's not like today's where we can get almost instant feedback on who's ordering what. You kind of had to call that too. It's like, is this going to be the game that is going to move during these winter seasons?
Oh yeah, and the lead times on this can be 6 months and up, and these are not cheap cartridges to build. These are expensive manufacturing, and you don't know how many Nintendo's actually going to be able to produce, because just 2 years earlier we had a massive chip shortage. Lots of cartridges that were ordered were not manufactured, and so right now nobody could really predict how many of the cartridges they ordered would be manufactured. Nintendo is still extremely cryptic going into the Christmas 1990 season about what they were going to produce large quantities of or not. And internally, everybody kind of knew, well, if your game sucks, they'll still give it the seal of approval as long as it works. But you might not get as many copies as somebody whose game was really good.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's all of this stuff swirling around. And this is also still the time when Nintendo is being investigated by the U.S. government for monopolistic activities. And so there wasn't a lot of predictability about how much inventory would be there, how much inventory wouldn't be there. And a lot of people just over-ordered on games that just weren't going to sell.
Yeah, I could see that. That's yeah, it's just such a tough call. I'm just trying to position myself as somebody who's ordering. Yeah, you said the 6 month lead time too. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
You're not just picking up a phone and getting something a week later. It's very much ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, think about digital distribution nowadays. It doesn't matter. You don't have to order any inventory ahead of time. And if you do find out, oh, there's a certain game mechanic here that isn't working for the players, you adjust it in a patch. Here, you bring the game out. Let's say you launch the game in June, but you know your biggest sale period will be in December. If by October you found out, wait, there's a certain game element that people are getting frustrated with, it's getting bad word of mouth, you've already put in your order for December 3 months ago. And there is no way for you to alter the code anymore. You're going into Christmas with the game as is.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scary thing for a publisher to have to do.
Yeah. I mean, there were the few really big games where you might see a revision here and there, but you can't just go around changing your game.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be your second printing, but you better have sold enough of them in the first printing to make that worthwhile.
Exactly. Yeah, the gamble for that.
Yeah, huge. And speaking of Nintendo's problems...
Yes, Nintendo admits some unlicensed games are illegal.
In a filing in the ongoing Nintendo versus Tengen case, which we first talked about during our April 1989 jump, Nintendo has admitted that the reverse-engineered games of American Video Entertainment, Color Dreams, and Share Data are not in fact violating their patented lockout chip. This may be another way to bolster their case against Tengen and weaken arguments from the Atari subsidiary that they are illegally monopolizing the market.
Oh, the Tengen carts. Where do we start with those?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's retreading a little bit of stuff that we've already talked about on the show, but because, like I said, we talked about it originally in April '89 when the lawsuit started, and it's still ongoing at this point. Obviously, in hindsight, Tengen, and actually, I just completed an interview with somebody who was at the board meeting when Tengen decided to do this, to engage in this battle. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting that one out there, but it's probably not going to come out until sometime in the summer because of the queue of interviews that I already have sitting on my hard drive. But highly interesting. The idea here is that Tengen did not do a clean room reverse engineering like these other companies did. Mm-hmm. Or in one case, they didn't actually do the reverse engineering. You still needed a real cartridge at first and stuff. But the idea here simply was they broke the law. They did not do what they were supposed to do, and they're heading into a calamity for their cartridges. But at the same time, their argument that Nintendo has monopolized the market with their lockout chip and has misused that monopoly power would still be a valid argument. And this is just an attempt by Nintendo to weaken that argument a little bit by saying, well, there are ways around it and people have done it and we won't go after these guys because they did it the right way. And all of this, of course, is almost a moot point because at this point, the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom, has already launched in Japan. The Super Nintendo is coming, and Nintendo already sees the end of the NES in sight. So for them, it's like, okay, we're loosening up the NES, knowing full well who cares at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
But they'd be setting the precedent for if this happens again for the SNES.
Yeah, and it won't become as big of an issue or an issue on the Super NES because the way that they're going to handle the lockout chips on the Super NES is going to be a different type of technology. So right. They're already changing the technology so that they don't have to run into these hurdles. And going into the Super NES, they're going to have a competitor with the Genesis, which has already been on the market since late '89 in the US. And so going in, they're not going to be the 800-pound gorilla anymore. And so the argument that they've monopolized the market doesn't work because they won't have a monopoly share of the market.
Right.
Yeah. So this is why we haven't seen another case like this against a console manufacturer, because no console has really had that market share ever again, with maybe the possible exception of the Sony PlayStation.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, this was like that transition time between those. Yeah, so you're seeing a lot of things that were very true even just a couple of years ago to something that's about to change the flip of a hat.
Exactly. I mean, it's just a completely different world at this point, where, I mean, you also have the TurboGrafx 16 is on the market at this point still. You just had the Neo Geo home system hit the market, at least in Japan. There's other consoles on the horizon. Atari is still talking up the Panther at this point. Their 16-bit super console that will get discontinued, will get canceled and replaced with the Jaguar. There's a bunch of stuff going on in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, fun stuff. And talking about consoles that weren't.
Yes.
Or sort of.
C64 GS games fail to materialize.
Commodore Format reports that while the C64 GS was easy to find in high street shops in the UK over Christmas, many of the promised cartridge releases were not. Games like Gremlins 2, Total Recall, Lotus, and Dick Tracy failed to get cartridge releases in time for the holiday season.
Womp womp. What does the GS stand for in the C64? Pardon my
Game
ignorance.
system.
Game system. Okay.
So what Commodore did was they took the guts out of a Commodore 64. Literally, just took the motherboard out. And in the original Commodore 64, the motherboard extended almost the entire space inside the box, inside the keyboard box. By this point in time, it's just essentially one board on the back of the box, where the cartridge slot and all the I/O ports and stuff are. And because times change, production methods get better, blah blah blah, and they just took that existing board that should have been hooked up to a keyboard, put it into this weird elongated white plastic square case, rectangular case, put the cartridge slot on the top as opposed to the back, and tried to sell it as a game console to compete with the NES.
That's one way to do it.
Except, of course, that one of the major selling points of the thing was that you got the very hot Terminator 2 game at the time. Only problem is they put it on a cartridge, but they didn't reprogram it. So to start the game, you still had to have an F1 key.
Oh.
Yeah. So you could play the cartridge version on a real C64, but you couldn't play it on the C64 game system.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
What an oversight.
Oh, huge blunder. And the problem is that the cartridges cost a lot more. And in England, where the C64 still had a very solid market, I mean, we talked a few months ago on the show about how a new games magazine for the C64 had just launched, Commodore Format. So, I mean, we're talking 9 years into the machine's life, it's getting a brand new glossy games magazine. And what's happened really here is in England, unlike all the other major territories, cassette was still the main data source for the Commodore 64. It was the main media. Not discs, not cartridges, but audio cassettes.
Why do you think that was?
Because the average English consumer didn't have a lot of money to spend, and cassette was cheap.
Oh, okay.
And these were little more than toys, especially at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So you weren't going to do any major work with the Commodore 64 unless you had GEOS and stuff, but nobody really did that much of that. It was a games machine. And if you were buying your kid this games machine, you wanted the media to stay cheap. And at this point, just like with the NES games, you had this huge back catalog of available software. And you could go into a newspaper, a news agent, and they'd have a spinner rack with cassette games for the major platforms of the day, like the Spectrum, the Amstrad, and the C64. And for a couple of bucks or a couple of pounds, you could buy a game and take it home and play it, and that's it. Because the media was so cheap, and the back catalog was basically just, okay, we've made our money off of it, now sell it for whatever price. Mm-hmm. And a cassette tape will probably cost the publisher maybe 10, 15, 20 cents a pop. Printing a cartridge with chips and stuff in it is going to cost you 5 to 10 pounds. And yeah, it'll load super fast, and in theory you could do much more complex games because you could constantly be loading stuff into memory, so you weren't limited to that 64K of memory per load. But the market is not a market for high-end games. It's little kids playing it, so you're not going to get the big strategy titles or anything having any real market share. And piracy is rampant. So even the games that were released on cartridge almost immediately get ripped and distributed as pirated copies. So, I mean, it was just, the publishers saw that this was a dumb idea. They knew Commodore was already kind of having some serious problems, and they were pushing the Amiga more. So they just canceled their plans to release cartridge versions. So you suddenly had this spec down Commodore 64 with no keyboard that wasn't really going to have any software available for it.
Yeah, I get both sides of that. That's depressing if someone got the game system.
Oh yeah,
have those games.
Terribly.
Those are some big titles too for the time.
Oh, definitely huge licenses. I mean, a few really good games did come out for the cartridge format, but most of them. I mean, if you were going to do a complex game, a one-button joystick wasn't going to be enough. You needed a space bar to play Turrican, for example, which suddenly you didn't have. So most of the major games were not going to be playable without some kind of new controller. And of course, Commodore was doing this as cheaply as they could. They even ended up, once they discontinued the GS, just tearing open the boxes, taking out the innards and putting them in C64s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that just paints such a dire situation for that whole release. Not that it wasn't already.
It was a shit show. That's all that is. That's the only way to describe it. A shit show. But I guess staying with the English computer scene.
Sure. Team 17 announces their first titles.
Amiga powerhouse and Worms Turner Outer, Team 17 has announced their first two titles coming to the Amiga, Alien Breed and Full Contact.
I am a huge Team 17 fan.
Oh, really?
Especially from the original Worms and on. I've pretty much followed them. They're still pretty much a household name with some of the games that they've been releasing. Just like not being afraid to push that envelope and make unique Team 17 style games.
That's true. I mean, they started out actually as a bunch of demo sceners. Mm-hmm. And it shows very much in the art style that they were using and a lot of the graphical effects. They were at home on the Amiga. The original Worms was written for the Amiga. Then there's one version of Worms, the director's cut, which is sort of a hybrid of elements from Worms 2 and Worms 1 that was their last game for the Amiga. But yeah, for several years, they were like, the standard bearers for the platform. You could argue that their gameplay may not have always been as well balanced as it should have been. Mm-hmm. For example, have you ever played Alien Breed?
Now is that the top-down shooter?
Yeah.
Okay, I've played it very briefly.
Yeah. Try playing Alien Breed. Or even better, Alien Breed 2. If you can survive for more than 10, 15 minutes in that game, congratulations. You're far more hardcore than me.
Yeah, the game's very Gauntlet. The game's very Gauntlet-esque, right? With like top-down, you're still... Oh, I guess you're shooting in this one.
Yeah. Well, in Gauntlet, you're shooting too. That's
true.
You're still throwing the axes or whatever. It's very Gauntlet-esque, only it's so hard. And it's unforgiving on so many aspects. But graphics are amazing. What they pull out of the Amiga, which is a 1985 hardware, or 84 if you want to get technical, is just quite impressive. This is going to start this new phase on the Amiga of these technically beautiful, if sometimes not all that great to play games. Body Blows will be their series of one-on-one fighters, basically their response to Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2, and a ton of other games over the next few years.
I miss game names like that of the time too. Like I don't know if you get a Body Blows these days.
Yeah, you could
Full
get
Contact.
away with it. Oh, or Super Frog. That was their jump and run game.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, yeah. You just couldn't pull that off nowadays. Nobody would be like, I'm going to play Super Frog. I mean, maybe as an iPhone game or something, but yeah, it just had a certain flair, a certain flavor that you don't get nowadays, sadly.
Yeah, that's definitely it.
Yeah. Oh, well, staying in computer games.
Sure. Steve Moretsky returns post-Infocom.
Celebrated Infocom designer Steve Moretsky is back after the collapse of Infocom at Bob Bates's new company, Legend Entertainment. Spellcasting 101, Sorcerers Get All the Girls, is an adventure game using a verb menu system and still images. The game would spawn 2 sequels and set the tone for many of Legend's humorous titles to come.
I don't know if I've heard of this one. Sorcerers
really?
Get All the Girls.
Oh, yeah, Spellcasting 101, it was kind of imagine Harry Potter crossed with Leisure Suit Larry.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Yeah. It's literally about a guy going through sorcerer school and having college frat party style antics as a huge nerd.
That sounds super cool. Where do I sign up?
Well, I mean, it's Legend Entertainment and Steve Moretsky. Steve Moretsky was not one of the original Infocom guys, but he came in almost immediately into it. And here again, I have to plug my interview with Michael Dornbrook because he talks extensively about the relationship of Moretsky to the other developers and stuff. And this guy was just legendary for his sense of humor. Leather Goddesses of Phobos was one of his. He may or may not have also worked on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game, and I want to say Planetfall as well, and I know Ethan's going to kill me if I got that wrong, but I'm too lazy to look it up right now. He's just a huge personality in the game industry, especially at that time, and this new hybrid system, it's kind of feels like, did you ever play any of the Legend Entertainment games? Like Eric the Unready or Superhero Team of Hoboken, or I'm getting the name of that one wrong too.
No, none of them are ringing a bell.
Okay. Basically, the old Infocom games were, of course, just straight up text. Okay. You typed in, a subject-verb combination, like, or more of an imperative system. So, pick up light or use lamp or whatever. And you type those in and hope that you got functional words. And at the same time, right now, of course, you've got the Sierra games where using, move the character around with the arrow keys or a joystick and then type in commands. LucasArts had already moved to the SCUM system with, a handful of verbs on the screen, and then you interact with items that way.
Right.
King's Quest V is just coming out around this time, and they're using no more words. It's all just a point-and-click interface with a handful of icons. And so these guys are kind of going backwards a little bit, but still giving a little bit of a concession to the modern day. And what they're doing is you get this long list of verbs, you get a long list of items in each location, and you're basically clicking on the verbs and the items to make combinations. And you have a picture in one corner and then a text window in another that tells you, description of the location, what is happening, responses to your actions, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a old Infocom style adventure game, but with some training wheels added and some
I gotcha.
Some ease of use additions.
Sure. Yeah, I spend a lot of time with the Sierra and LucasArts adventure games. I'm definitely familiar with the format, but
Yeah, me too. Those were more my bread and butter back in the day, especially because the Legend games never got ported to the Amiga, and I was an Amiga user, so didn't get to play them. I wanted to. I always admired Moretsky's writing, even though I didn't spend a lot of time on Infocom games, but spent enough time that I was like, I wish I could play these, but I don't know if I could go back to that type of interface nowadays.
yeah, I understand. It's very much a product of the time, and this is still when adventure games are making that jump from, are we going full text-based? What kind of like verb parsing are we doing to help the user get from point A to point B? That sort of thing. So it's interesting to see this Infocom's take on that, because again, I have to admit I'm not very familiar with Infocom's.
Oh yeah,
entries in the genre.
It's one of the Infocom games are one of those things that you probably need to at least play one or two just to be able to say you had the experience to put it into a historical context. But at the same time, they're so frustrating because often you just spend ages trying to figure out what is the verb that the program's going to understand here. And that frustration is, I mean, even though you figured out what the puzzle should be, if you can't figure out the right word, you're screwed. Right. And yeah, that's why it's just, I mean, I understand the limitations of the time, and there's some real business reasons why they kept that format for as long as they did. Again, check out my interviews with Michael Dornbrook, goes into all that. But yeah, this is sort of the reinvention of that. And Legend Entertainment's going to be around for a few more years doing stuff. And Moretsky is then going to start different companies later, but we'll talk about those in a couple of years when we get to that point in the story. And sticking with computer entertainment,
Sweeping minds want to know.
Microsoft has announced the release of the Microsoft Entertainment Pack for Windows. This collection of mini-games for Windows 3.0 will see the debut of several titles for the GUI system, most notably the legendary Minesweeper, that would become a mainstay for the OS.
Wow. I haven't thought about that pack in a very long time. I was a 3.1 user way back when. There was one where it was like a cat and mouse game where you had to push the blocks and get cheese and avoid the cats. I spent way too much time on that one.
I don't even remember that one.
And this was like Ski Free era, and
yeah.
Oh man, yeah, this is I would be super excited with this announcement at the time, especially because I remember going from DOS to Windows, and that was such a big jump from like, oh, this mouse thing has a use now.
Yeah, I mean it really was a revolution if you were a DOS user. It yes. really finally opened up this idea that your machine was not your enemy anymore. Granted, IRQ conflicts and so forth were still going to be a part of your life for quite a few more years. But yeah, it was a necessary jump. And Minesweeper, just the idea that you were going to have these little casual games built in, well, not built in, but it would be built in a little bit later to just while away some time between your spreadsheets is going to become fundamental to our modern life in many ways.
Yeah, these are full GUI games. They're not text-based. They're not, I mean, some of them had keyboard inputs, but largely they were purely able to be controlled by the mouse.
Exactly. And while they were mainstays on other systems, like, for example, the Atari ST and the Amiga, because they had built-in GUIs already back in 85 and the mouse was a standard implement, bringing that kind of gameplay to the work machine that was DOS really is a change. And Minesweeper doesn't originate on DOS or Windows. It was originally a game, the first release was either Unix or Mac, but this is the debut of it on an IBM compatible, which is really where it's going to become the famous diversion that it became.
Yes. Yeah, that. And I remembered it was called Rodent's Revenge, and also I remember playing Pipe Dream a lot.
Oh, Pipe Dream was awesome.
Yeah, Pipe Dream was a cool one.
Yeah, and then
that purple goo was.
Yeah, and then later on they also had a port of Chips Challenge.
Yes, that's a classic.
Oh, love that game so much. Played that on the C64 forever. Oh, good times. The one saving grace of the links, if you will. Because that's where the game started. So
links, wow.
Yeah, that was like the Atari Lynx game that stood out, that everybody was like, ooh, yeah, this one's fun to play.
I had no idea.
Yeah. That's where the game starts. And then it gets ported to all sorts of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, granted, the game concept had been around before. There was actually the home computer game licensed off the old Centurions cartoon and toy line. Had almost the same game concept, where you'd have to, instead of just a different pair of shoes to access different areas, you changed your equipment. Don't know if you're familiar with the Centurions TV show. Maybe a little bit before your time.
Yeah, just a little bit. I'd have to dust off some cobwebs to see if there's anything there, but there's a very good chance it's not.
It was basically this short-lived toy line where the main gimmick was that the characters had these little, not suction cups, but little pegs all over their suits, and you could buy different armaments to click into those. So, you could have the water thing where basically they had little floaters on the side or something, or they could turn into flight, little wings on the sides, or wheels to be like a vehicle or whatever. And when they made a computer game out of that, they just had the Chips Challenge like camera from the top. And to run over water, you'd have to get, the boat suit. And it was basically just they slapped the license on an existing action puzzle game.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a few years before Chips Challenge. But it wasn't a new concept at that point either. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Chips Challenge, the one that survived the history books.
Exactly. It's the one that made it through. But okay, talking about old games.
Yes. Budget game market heats up in the UK.
With the 16-bit markets maturing and back catalogs for the Amiga and ST growing, as well as the 8-bit systems increasingly being relegated to the poorer segments of the market, more and more publishers are flooding into the budget software business. Psygnosis has announced their budget label Sizzlers that will retail between £8 and £9 each. EA renames their line to Star Performers, selling at £10. US Gold has launched a second 16-bit budget line, Kicks, 16-bit at £8 in addition to their existing Classics with X line that will now concentrate on more complex games and be priced at up to £15. Codemasters, the king of budget games, are claiming to be bigger than the Beatles as they conquered the Gallup charts for 1 week, outselling Ocean, US Gold, and Virgin combined.
Those are so many buzzwords for their titles that have just been around.
Yeah. And this is one of those things where this phenomenon never really hit as big in the States. But the U.S. never had the volume of releases that Europe was used to. Again, I have to point to one of my previous interviews, Jerry Wolosenko, who was an early was in distribution of computer software back in the very early 80s, and later on was the U.S. liaison for Psygnosis. And he had to keep telling the Psygnosis guys, okay, you guys are pumping out like a game a month or a game every 2 months in England. I can't distribute that many games in the States because the distances are bigger, the ad budgets have to be higher, and the mom and pop shops that are selling the games at this point just can't take on that many new titles. It takes longer for them to figure out, okay, do we want to reorder? Do we not want to reorder? And so forth. The market just was completely different. Whereas in England, the computer software and consoles at this point in Europe are basically non-issues. They don't really exist. They're such a minute part of the market. They're insignificant. And computers are the gaming platforms. Games are cheap to manufacture. Everybody buys a lot of games, and it's a machine that just needs to keep being fed. And now they're competing on price. So it's the same as with the NES carts in the US, that back catalog is going to start seriously draining market share from new titles, as everybody's like, well, why should I buy a new game when I can buy this hit from 2 years ago for a fraction of the price?
Yeah, and less risk on whether it's going to be good or not if it's been established.
Exactly. And at this point, the Amiga and ST have been around for years. The 8-bit systems have been around for even longer. So it's not like you could say, oh, I need to buy this new game because it can do something spectacularly new. It's getting harder and harder to pull new tricks out of that old hardware. So the games from a year or two earlier, for the most part, don't look any better or worse than the games that are currently coming out.
Yeah, how much is too much with those?
Exactly. And this is where the question of how many titles, how many SKUs can you keep on the shelf at any given time? And at what point do you have so many SKUs, you have so much selection? It's kind of like, opening up a MAME ROM folder and seeing 20,000 games, being like, I can't decide what I want to play. And then you spend half an hour looking, and then you decide, okay, I'm not going to play anything. Let's watch something on Netflix. And then spend the same 20 minutes looking for something, and then deciding, I'll go over to YouTube. And then you spend 20 minutes trying to figure out what you want to watch on YouTube.
And there weren't algorithms to pick stuff for you either. You had to, you were at your own mercy for that. That's wild. Yeah, because again, I'm growing up overseas. It's you had your Nintendos, you had all of that. You didn't have, because you were also loyal, it sounds like, to your platform.
Because you couldn't afford a second platform.
Exactly.
I mean, remember, the initial outlay for a computer was still more than the initial outlay for the console.
Mm-hmm.
Where you made it up again was on the software. So let's say you bought an NES for $150. But each cartridge is going to set you back $60. Well, right. I can also buy a Commodore 64 at this point for $150 or let's say $250. Once I buy, all the extra stuff for it, drives and stuff. Say I'm at $250, but now I've got 7 or 8 years worth of software that's available for $2.99 a pop. It's not going to take very long before I have more games than I'll ever be able to play, and I'm so much money ahead of the NES kid.
Exactly, and these are full games that we're talking about too. It's not like I remember growing up in the DOS era, I would have a couple of games that I'd have the full games for, and then you'd have access to demos and all sorts of, some of them were the shareware model, and other ones were like pay for a small piece of it. Mm-hmm. So you had tons of options.
Well, in England at this point, and also in Spain and Germany and France, the magazines have cover tapes or cover discs.
Right.
And so in England, all of these magazines that I've been pulling articles out of, if they're a system-dedicated magazine, they will have a cover tape or disc that has at least one old commercial game and demos of other games. So you basically have this infinite flow of software coming at you just by virtue of buying the magazine each month. And that hasn't ended even to this day. I mean, today when I can still get magazines that have cover DVDs or cover CDs that have full games on them. And that's part of the allure of buying the magazine, that I'm getting these games with it.
Sure. Yeah, the whole concept of magazines pushing software hadn't even dawned on me until just now. It's not something that I think about too much. Wow.
Yeah, and so this was why, I mean, it was just this smorgasbord of software coming at you at prices that, I mean, you were still pirating. God knows you were still pirating, but you could also have this massive collection of cassettes and be like, hey, look at my pile of cassettes, you know? And so, yeah, it's one of those things where part of it is they're cannibalizing their own market, but at the same time, if they don't re-release the games on these budget prices, nobody's going to buy them. And because disc and cassette media is so cheap, you can afford to do this.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. And I mean, even love or hate piracy, it was still the chance to try before you buy, and then if you really like something, you'd want to have that cartridge.
Yeah. And also, as opposed to consoles, there's no licensing fee to the hardware manufacturer.
Oh, true. Doubly true, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, you can never sell an NES game for less than the licensing fee. Even if you discounted the manufacturing cost, you could never get it below the licensing fee. But there's no licensing fee to the computer maker. There's no licensing fee to anybody. You just buy the media. I mean, it's not even like, you're going to put digital film on there or something. Now you have to pay a licensing fee to the codec maker or whatever else.
Yeah.
All of those fees disappear. And it's just the cost of making the cassette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still find it very novel that format is the same format that's used for audio cassettes, which was also a huge other market driving that format.
Well, just think about right after this, we shift to CD-ROM, which is the same format we were using for audio. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a question: is it data or is it not data?
Yeah.
And but okay, episode's getting long in the tooth. We have one final story, and John, you may not be familiar with this, but we try to have a tradition here on the show of ending episodes when possible with the death of a company. But today, in honor of you being here and the fact that, this is the way the notes were written way before I knew you were going to be here, we have not the death, but a birth.
Id is born.
On February 1st, 1991, id Software was officially founded by John Romero, John Carmack, Adrian Carmack, and Tom Hall.
There's no way this could be a coincidence that this is the closing headline.
And why would that be? Tell our listeners who may not be familiar with your particular predilections for gaming.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I didn't grow up with an NES. I had a DOS system for a very long time, and I started with Apogee games, which then grew into the love of id games. And even before Doom and Wolfenstein, there was
Commander Keen.
The Wizard, the 3D Wizard game that
Catacomb, 3D Catacombs.
3D Catacombs, Terror of the Catacombs, and there was a ton of Catacombs because there was Leapfrog games? It was Frog games that did some too. But I still have an Apogee box from way back when. I just got all of my old DOS boxes from storage, and I have them proudly displayed. It's nice. Oddly relevant. Like, again, I grew up. I still play Doom mods.
Oh, hell yeah!
That game spawned so many careers, and just people still tinker around with the code. Like, there's still games coming out right now that are using that code from way back when. But yeah, I don't even know where where to fully focus on this announcement. This is one of the big heavy hitters that really pushed what was capable on PC platforms.
Yeah, and I mean it comes from the fact that you've got a genius like John Carmack in here. You've got super talented designers and programmers like John Romero in here. Mm-hmm. And you have, right at this moment, and this is, again, a theme that we've been talking about for almost since the beginning of the show, this creeping meme, if you will, this idea that the PC platform is upgradable, and if you're going to play games, you just accept the fact you're going to be upgrading some part of your hardware on a fairly regular basis, and they are coming into it at a moment when it's like, okay, we're not programming for the lowest common denominator. Let's just program for a kick-ass machine and let the people come to us. Let the people upgrade for us. And I mean, Wing Commander just came out a few months ago before this, which was basically the game that starts it all. That's the one that's just like, you know what? You want to play our game, you have to buy at least $2,000 worth of hardware. We're flopping our big, huge, you know what, on the table, and you know you want it. You know how wonderfully it glistens in the light. You have to pay the piper to enjoy it. And it's going to keep going. I mean, Ultima Underworld is already under development at this point.
Okay.
And Wolfenstein is already under development at this point. There's it's all coming. It's going to come, and it's going to be huge, and it's just going to keep pushing that hardware up and up and up, and demand will also help the prices drop. So it is born. And on that happy note, we are at the end of our journey to February of 1991. John, I cannot thank you enough for coming along on this journey.
Oh, well, I can't thank you enough for taking me along, especially for such a monumental year in gaming.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to come, but yeah, this was a good month. Some fun new stuff on the horizon. Any closing thoughts, comments, plugs for your show that you would like to give to our listeners?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I kind of gave an introduction of what we do as part of Retro Game Squad. If you wanted to find us, we have a pretty active Discord. That's, again, if you lean towards more console gaming, the retro consoles, you'd fit very well in that family. And we accept any nerds with a love for anything retro. That I think you'd find a lot of home. It's funny because we have gamers that grew up in the UK, and we also have gamers that grew up in the US, and kind of the dueling perspectives of how we grew up that's become increasingly more apparent as we have these conversations. So we're on any podcast station, and our Discord link is discord.retrogamesquad.com. So if you feel like coming by and saying hi, we'd love to have you.
And I'll put that in the show notes down below, so everybody should check it out. I also try to look in occasionally when my my massive reading for this show allows. Okay, everybody, this has been a lot of fun. Peter should be back next week if he is not completely swamped still at work. Again, thank you, John, for coming on. Remember, everybody, check us out down on Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And I guess, we do need a word of the week, word for the episode. John, would you like to choose something?
Sizzlers.
Sizzlers. Oh, awesome. Perfect. Okay, Sizzlers it is. Okay, everybody, have fun.